Ik was zo bang dat die kakjes mij zal vangen, ver oor die zeeweg sneeuw. Toen vlug ik naar die kant van die Oppingtonse zand, daaronder bij de grote rivier. O, breng mij terug naar die oude...
Hi guys, just relaxing on the couch. It's a rainy day. Finally the rains have come. It's your old friend Cherry Carter, here to talk to you about the goings on of the Bushveldt Carbineers out there in the Spelonken back in mid-1901. And last episode we heard about the Valdezia 6, didn't we? The execution ordered by Captain Taylor. Captain Taylor was funneling goods and stolen property up to Rhodesia. We'll have a look on the map. When I drove up there, I showed us on the map, we're quite close to the border of Zimbabwe. Okay, so pick up the car from the airport. We're in Boksburg. So we get on the freeways. We're going to go up past Pretoria, all the way up there, past Warmbath. Remember where we saw the Tasmanians at Bella Bella and Johan. And then we're going to go all the way up here past Potgietersrus, past Petersburg, and all the way up there to Louis Trichardt. We're not far from the Zimbabwe border. We're not going to go that far. We're going to stop at Louis Trichardt. So Captain Taylor was stealing those horses and those cattle and selling them in Rhodesia at the time. You could get a better price for a good horse or oxen, cattle in Rhodesia than you could in South Africa. So we think that's where the gold was funneled as well, that was stolen from those Boers in their wagons. That's Captain Taylor for you. But today we're looking at the death of Trooper Van Buuren. So what I understand, Van Buuren was what they call a joiner, an Afrikaaner joiner. These were Boers that sided with the British. Now, in the Boer War, it was a bit like the Civil War. There were English-speaking Afrikaners. But they were the minority, and there were English people as well living in South Africa, farming and mining and running stores and that sort of thing. So obviously some of them would have joined the British side, and others fought for the Boer republics. In the film, when we see these joiners, they're normally in civilian clothing. They were using them as like scouts.
Where's Captain Hunt?
They were waiting for us.
There were many men. Captain Hunt was shot.
There was nothing we could do. Bullets whizzing around us like blowflies. There was nothing we could do. They must have known we was coming.
Known? Of course they bloody knew. You can't trust these blokes. How many sides are you fighting on, mate?
But with Van Buuren being a trooper, I really don't know whether he wore a uniform. Excuse me. I tend to think he would have. I think he would have worn the uniform of the Carbineers, having a trooper number. But I can't really find any photos of him. I'll have a look through Charles's book, see if we can find any photos. It's generally assumed that Handcock killed Van Buuren. We're going to see a little bit of Fort Edward. And there were prisoners that were taken in, that were kept in what they called bird cages. The film shows Boer prisoners in a bird cage.
Wat gaan nou gebeur?
Stay still.
Ek weet nie, jong. Ek vertrou hulle nie. Wragtig nie.
Still!
They're part of the group that killed Simon Hunt.
In their version of Fort Edward, we're going to see the real Fort Edward, or where it was. Van Buuren approached the cage where these prisoners were, and he was heard to be exchanging details about the Valdezia massacre, even pointing out who was involved, who shot those Boers. and I guess for the Bushveldt Carbineers, or Morant and Handcock in particular, they were worried about reprisals against them. So that seems to be why they wanted to silence Van Buren. In the film, it's actually the German missionary that approaches the cage that gets Morant riled up and furious. But it was Van Buren that approached them in this incident. And so we'll hear from Charles about what happened. And there's a photo of me leaning above a couple of those markers that they put on the graves of the dead servicemen, the soldiers in South Africa. I saw lots of them, but they've got 4 or 5 of them planted at Fort Edward. And there's a photo of me leaning over a couple of these. I didn't know at the time, but one of them that I'm leaning on is Van Buren. When you see the photo, it'll make sense. All right, it's another cracking adventure, so buckle in, saddle up, and let's ride out back to the Spelonken. See you there. So this is what Charles has written about the death of Trooper B.J. Van Buren. Whilst Boers, women and children were being held in the bird cages, they were holding camps at Fort Edward, awaiting transportation to the concentration camp in Petersburg, they frequently spoke to those troopers who were joiners. This interaction took place despite the bitter hatred that had split these fellow countrymen apart. The prisoners felt a great need to be informed and updated of events taking place around them. So yeah, they did. The Afrikaners, the Boers, they didn't like the joiners. You can understand that. They considered them traitors. So on his return from Valdezia, now I couldn't find reference whether Van Buren was one of the troopers who shot those 6 Boers, but he certainly knew about it. Yeah, on his return from Valdezia, Trooper Van Buren was seen talking to the prisoners and even pointing out Sergeant Oldham's patrol that killed the Boers. By this action, he was signing his own death warrant. That's in inverted commas. Many of the other troopers were already expressing their unease at the communication between captives and joiner Boers. So Captain Robinson and maybe Captain Taylor decided that Van Buren could no longer be trusted. Yeah, there was also distrust of these joiners by the British, and we see some of that in the movie when Captain Hunt and his patrol have been killed approaching the farmhouse. They think that the joiner had something to do with warning the Boers about the Carbineers coming to attack. So so he couldn't be trusted, and Captain Robinson ordered Lieutenant Handcock to attend to the matter. It's time we found out a bit more about Handcock, so we'll be doing, I'll be calling this player number 2. We'll concentrate on Handcock, but let's continue with the story of Van Buren. 2 days later, on 4th of July 1901, Lieutenant Peter Handcock rode out of the camp with a hand-picked patrol of 4 men, supposedly to investigate Boer activity close by. The men were Troopers Van Buren, J. Eden, J.T. Arnold, E. Brown, and M.A. Churton. Churton and Van Buren were ordered to the left flank and the others to the right flank of the bridle path. Churton, riding in front, heard a horseman approaching from the rear. He turned in time to see that it was Lieutenant Handcock, and that Handcock drew his handgun as he came alongside Van Buren and rapidly fired 3 shots into Van Buren's back. Then, drawing his horse up along Churton, Handcock told him to keep a sharp lookout as they had just lost a man back there. Robertson, upon receiving the report from Handcock of a contact with Boers and one of their troopers being shot, ordered to patrol out to retrieve the body for burial at the fort. The significance in Bushveldt Carbineer terminology of left and right flank is described by Schulenberg in a paper delivered to the Afrikaans history journal Historia. Quote, "A reign of terror existed among the men. It was understood that if a man was ordered to the left flank, his doom was sealed. This was so well known that men refused to leave camp alone and invariably kept their rifles handy and loaded. The above claim is substantiated by an attempt on the life of Sergeant J.G. Rogers. Quote, a Sergeant Rogers was ordered to make an attack on some Boer prisoners but refused. Next day he was ordered off to the left flank to scout. Someone had been told off to watch him and shoot him. He was fired at but got away unwounded."
It wasn't miles and miles and miles away. It was right there.
So
Now,
we're just at the gate where we've left Captain Taylor's office, and we're looking over the road to a ridge where some trees are. That's the vicinity where Fort Edward was.
is Bushveldt Carbineers.
Yeah, there's
And this is Van Buuren. He is the guy who was shot by Handcock. He was shot somewhere in this area.
Oh,
And that's listed on that, yes. And it's on this board as well.
He's his Afrikaans name.
Yes, Van Buuren is an Afrikaans name.
Right.
And he was shot because he, being an Afrikaner, he was seen talking to the mothers and daughters, mothers and children in what they call the bird cages, which was up the back here, where they were in a holding situation because they were awaiting transport to the concentration camp. He was seen talking to them, and he was at that where those 8 Boers were shot. Van Buuren. And it was Handcock who, and Captain Taylor was also here at the time. They decided that this guy was going to cause problems for them. So they went up somewhere, I don't know, they said that there was Boer movement or Boer activity somewhere around here, and there were 2 of them and 4 of them. 2 were told by Handcock to take a right flank, and the other 2 were taken to take a left flank, and he was behind the guy who was with him. The guy who was with him might have been Muurchurton, I'm not sure, it's listed in my book. And he said, Muurchurton said, he heard a horse approaching, and he turned around fearing the worst, and it was not the enemy, it was Handcock. Lieutenant Handcock was on the horse. Right. And then he sort of relaxed, and as he proceeded on his horse, he heard the shot, and when then he jumped off, and he saw Van Buuren on the ground.
Right.
So that happened here, somewhere here, and then
Fort Edward is still called Fort Edward, this area, and it's all very central. It's all centred around Elam. All the events that we've been talking about today are around Elam, and in the magnificent background, I'm going to get a few of this, is they're called the Zoutpansberg.
Zoutpansberg.
Is that Sugar Mountains or something?
Salt.
Oh, Salt Mountains.
Because of the salt pans, which are to the west and on the other side of the mountain.
And these mountains stretch all the way around them, absolutely magnificent. There's towering gorges, and they're covered in thick, dense. Several depositions concerning the shooting of Van Buuren were sent to Petersburg, and in essence told a similar story. Some even stated that there was no sign of Boers in the area at the time. Was this killing merely intended to silence witnesses on the callous and blatant murder of prisoners? A particularly disturbing but unconfirmed report of the murder of Trooper Van Buuren reads as following, quote, a trooper of the corps, a Boer named Van Buuren, on witnessing the first of the murders, remonstrated, whereupon Lieutenant Handcock fired 3 revolver shots at him. The first hit him in the mouth, the second in the body, and the third in the head. He then broke his skull with the butt of a rifle. It was the same man, Handcock, who shot the German missionary and his servant. So Lieutenant Handcock wrote a report on this incident to Captain Robinson, who deemed it unsuitable and thus edited it to read that Van Buuren had been shot in a contact with some Boers. The official version of Van Buren's death was then sent to Petersburg, where Major Lenihan accepted it in good faith. Lieutenant George Whitten, who had not yet arrived in the Spelonken, stated around this time that Captain Robertson had suggested to Major Lenihan that he, Robertson, be recommended for the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, in recognition of his services, which would have included the elimination of the 6 Boers. At about the same period of time, a charge of molestation was laid by a certain local lady against an officer in the Spelonken district. Further investigation from Petersburg established that the officer implicated was indeed Captain Robertson. He was immediately recalled to Petersburg HQ and given the option of standing trial at a court-martial to prove his innocence in the molestation charge or resign his commission. He chose the second option and he left the Corps. The following extract, again from Schulenberg's paper to Historia, warrants consideration, particularly in view of what had happened near Valdezia. Quote, "It will be related later how all those on the British side involved in this episode, the shooting of the 6 Boers, from Taylor right down to the troopers who did the killing, were exonerated, while Australians who became involved in similar episodes were court-martialed and executed. This was the first of a series of episodes which upset the Australian government and its people. It led to a deep dissatisfaction and distrust, not to say the least, of Kitchener and the British Army, which had not been fully erased to this day. There is in fact proof of numerous other incidents where unarmed Boers were shot by the British, about which nothing was said or done." Okay, so this I've found is this led to the opening of charges against the Australians stationed at Fort Edward. It was a letter that was sent to Colonel Hall in Petersburg, and it was signed by non-commissioned officers and men of the Bushveldt Carbineers. And this is the charges or the allegations against their officers, which opened the court case and the court-martial. But charge number 2 is mentioned in this letter, and it's dated July the 14th. It says, "Trooper Van Buren disapproved of the events of the 2nd of July and communicated the true facts of the case to relatives of the murdered men." That must have been in the birdcage. Next day, he was taken out by Lieutenant Handcock, BVC, in a district where the patrol affirms that there was not a single Boer to be seen. Trooper Van Buren never came back. Lieutenant Handcock saying he had been shot by Boers, but it is the consensus of opinion of the men that Van Buren was shot by Lieutenant Handcock and not by the Boers. This is more readily believed as Lieutenant Handcock has repeatedly threatened to shoot any man who spoke a word of dissent from the questionable proceedings. The troopers who were nearest to the deceased were Troopers Eden, Arnold and Brown. So let's look at Peter Handcock, one of the central figures in this story, played of course by Brian Brown in the movie Breaker Morant. He had to grow a moustache for it.
I'm not much of a letter writer, you know. If you ever heard from me, it'd probably be bad news.
So Peter Joseph Handcock was a veterinarian and transport lieutenant for the number 19A Squadron Bushveldt Carbineers. Born in 1869 at Peel, a few miles from Bathurst in New South Wales. He was apprenticed as a blacksmith at 12, and he grew into a tall, strong youth who was considered morally and physically clean living, careful financially, and he was no crude overstepper of social conventions, whatever that means. He married at the age of 21. By 1900 he had 3 children. Though he worked as a blacksmith with the railways department, he also had a skill with horses.
Oh, watch it, Peter! Ooh, probably just a stand bruise. He'll be all right.
You reckon that's all it is then?
Yeah, if he limps again, swipe another horse for a few.
Without alerting his family, he went to Sydney and enlisted for 12 months as a shoeing smith, number 488, in the C Squadron 1st New South Wales Mounted Rifles. So he returned home to tell his family, and shortly after, on the 17th of January 1900, he sailed for South Africa. Promoted to farrier sergeant, saw action at Dreyfontein, and he was with Roberts on the march to Pretoria. He was involved in the actions at Diamond Hill and the attempt to trap the vet in the Brentwater Basin. So I went to Diamond Hill to that battle. I know Morant was there as well as like a... he was a messenger, Morant, riding between the different British camps. Anyway, when the 1st New South Wales Mounted Rifles returned, he decided to stay in South Africa. His adjutant in the New South Wales Mounted Rifles described him as a really good man, the best of them. One of his colleagues said, "He was with us as shoeing smith and more courteous and obliging fellow you could not meet." Every soldier who knew him respected him. His conduct was excellent, and he would never give you any idea that he would do anything brutal. We're going to hear later on, when the court case comes up, of some of the references that Peter Handcock got, and it's hard to, align them with some of the actions that he was accused of and found guilty of. Anyway, to continue, he obtained a commission as a lieutenant in the Bushveldt Carbineers with effect from the 21st of February 1901 and became veterinary and transport officer for the unit. At 30, although he may have been a year or two older, farrier, 5'10", fair complexion, blue eyes, light brown hair, prominent nose, trace marks on left forearm, birthmark near left eye, back mottled with a scald scar on shoulder. Next of kin, his sister, Mrs. J. Dempsey of Peel, Bathurst, New South Wales, and he served in Spelonken under Captain Robertson and later under Captain Hunt and Lieutenant Morant. So, following an order from Captain Robinson, he shot Trooper Van Buuren for alleged treachery while they were out on patrol. He was also involved with other shootings in the Spelonken and was tried by court-martial along with other BVC officers. He was found guilty of shooting Boer prisoners and sentenced to death with a strong recommendation for mercy. He and Lieutenant Morant were also charged with the shooting of the missionary Heese, but were found not guilty. Handcock had led a patrol which found Heese's body some days after he'd been shot. Prior to the trials, Handcock was kept in solitary confinement for some 3 months, and even the military chaplain for the area was told not to speak to him. He was a broken man, and it seems ready to confess to anything. He did make some confessions to please Colonel Carter, he said, but because of the duress under which they were made, they were not even presented to the court. After the court-martial, Handcock, along with Morant and other BVC officers, were taken to Pretoria in an open truck, handcuffed and under guard, and arrived there on the 21st of February 1902. On the 23rd of February, Handcock and Morant were moved to the condemned cells. They found a good friend in Warder, Morrow, who served with Morant in the 2nd South Australian Mounted Rifles. On the 26th of February, the governor of the jail informed the two that they had been sentenced to death, and the sentence would be carried out at dawn the next day. Handcock wrote a last letter to his sister, Mrs. Dempsey, expressing the hope that his country would look after his children. So we'll leave it there with Peter Handcock. We'll hear more about him when we look into the trial and the court-martial and the execution. But for the moment, that's Peter Handcock in a nutshell.
Een zonnergedal langs die mooie rivierse val, het zij voor oorlogsdagen blij. O, breng mij terug naar die oud Transvaal.